So the DSLR can be a very intimidating piece of equipment. You have dials and buttons here, you have dials and buttons here, and you have more dials and buttons here. And then when you switch it on, you get confronted with even more numbers, letters, symbols which you don't know about. Not only here on some cameras, but also here, like on this Canon 80D, which is also a touchscreen, and then you can go into and mess around more settings. So let's start with this bad boy here, or maybe this one. On and off switch, very self-explanatory, and here is what I call the master switch or the mode dial. And I always shoot my videos in manual because I have full control over the camera. You can also do aperture priority or shutter priority. Some cameras it's TV, some cameras it's S. If you're not sure about anything, put it into automatic and the camera does a pretty good job of doing what it needs to be doing. But first we have to realize what these magic settings of ISO, aperture and shutter speed actually do for our video. So currently I am shooting remotely from my iPhone, so I can control the settings while I'm recording this, so I can show you the differences in what the settings do. So let's start off with shutter speed. Now all shutter speed, aperture and ISO adjust how much light goes into the camera and therefore affecting your picture quality, your depth of field, your brightness, and how noisy or how much of that sand is on your picture. So I have got the Canon Connect app connected and recording here as we speak. So apologies for the lighting, but one of my bulbs is out, so we have to make do with that. Now I'm going to go onto the camera. I'm going to go onto the phone now, and currently we are shooting with 25 frames per second at a shutter speed of 1/50, the 2-for-1 rule, at an aperture of f5.6 and an ISO of 1000. So I'm going to go into the settings, and first of all I'm going to adjust the shutter speed, which normally you wouldn't, like I said in the video, but let's see what happens anyway, and this will help you with pictures anyway. So 1/50th of a second going to 1/160. You can already see the picture is much darker and the camera is now finding it very difficult to focus on me. Go even more to 1/1000th of a second, and I think you can just see a little bit of my white t-shirt. Back again, here we go, 1/50th, and the camera is now waking up, starting to focus. So there's the shutter speed. 1/50th at 25 frames a second, or if you're filming at 60 frames per second, go for 120. Remember, if you do that, your picture's going to be darker, you're going to need more light. Now we're going to move on to the aperture. Now I'm at 5.6, which is as wide as this camera will go, I think, for this setting. Yep, so I'm zoomed in completely. This is a variable aperture lens, so the aperture changes with the focal length. So I'm zoomed in currently at 18mm. This is a wide angle 10 to 18mm lens, and the widest the aperture will go is 5.6. So I'm going to increase the aperture number and hence make the hole in the lens smaller, and now it's at f.8. So you can already see it's getting darker. Smaller hole means less light. Going to f11, f16, f22. So you get the picture, or in this case you don't. Now we're done shutter speed. aperture. Now, for video, the shutter speed you want at 1/50th, or again, double what the frame rate you're filming at. Aperture, the widest possible, or the smallest number will create that kind of blurry background. The bigger the aperture number, or the smaller the hole, the less light goes into your camera, and therefore you'll not get that depth of field and everything will be more in focus. Now, like I said, I prefer an auto ISO because this then regulates how much light hits your sensor when you have a fixed aperture and shutter speed. So let me go into the ISO settings now on my phone, and currently this is at ISO 1000 because I need some more light hitting the sensor of the camera. Let's go down to 100 and it's dark. Now if you're in bright daylight outside, 100 will be more than enough. Let's bring it back up to 800 and you can see more light hitting the sensor, the picture's getting brighter, and the camera should now focus on me any minute now. There we go. Let's go to ISO 1600, brighter already, 3200, 6400, and the maximum I have set now, because I do have a maximum on my ISO, at 12,800. Now, let me switch the lights off for a second, and let me pull the blinds down. Now, as you can see, everywhere on this wall here and this wall here, you have a black sand. That's called grain or noise. Now, the higher the ISO, the more of those speckles you will get. The better quality of camera you have, that noise should be a little bit less. So let us start with the on-screen display and what each of these options are showing us. Now you can manipulate how much info is actually shown on the touchscreen by pressing the info button on your camera. You can minimize it to 0, have just the basic information, more detailed information, and the detailed information with a histogram as well. I always like to use it like so. In here, on the starting from the top left, you have the mode which the camera is in, your battery percentage, as well as the time available for video recording. With this model, you have 29.59 minutes available per recording session. Your focus mode, your video quality, your mic settings, headphone settings, autofocus, shutter speed, aperture, exposure compensation, ISO, white balance, picture style, and other options which you won't use as a beginner setup. Pressing the Q button allows us to adjust all the options that I've just spoken about before. Let's start with the autofocusing. You have an autofocus mode with face tracking. You have a multi-zone which will focus on all different points within the camera's range, and you have an autofocus single point which will concentrate on one point that you choose from the whole system. I like to use the autofocus with face tracking here. With the picture quality, this camera allows you to film at 50 frames per second at high definition, as well as 25 frames per second. I shoot in 25 frames per second. Please remember that at 25 frames per second, we go for the 2-for-1 rule, which means that your shutter speed will be at 1/50th as shown here. If you're shooting at 50 frames per second, please go here and adjust to 100. This will make the video look not too blurry and not too smooth, a perfect combination. With your aperture, try and shoot at the lowest possible aperture, which is the largest spread your camera has available on its aperture. At the moment, this camera, for a shutter speed of 50, the aperture is at f-stop 5. I like to leave my ISO on automatic purely because it lets the camera adjust the ISO without adjusting any other of the settings which I've set before. For more advanced users, you can start playing around with the ISO speed. Just remember, the higher you go with the ISO, the more noise you're going to get on your video recording. So I like to set an auto. I go in and outdoors all the time, and that just helps with the picture quality for me. I leave the camera at auto white balance. Again, for more advanced users, you can play around with that. Let's talk about the picture style, and you can see I have a picture style 1 here. You adjust that by going into the Q menu, pressing the picture style button, and here you have different picture styles available. I have a user-defined CineStyle, which I've downloaded from the website. It gives a more flat feel to the picture. If you go into the picture style on a more info button, you can notice that the sharpness is set down as low as possible, and I do all my sharpening in post in Final Cut Pro. You can also access the menu features and adjust the settings by pressing the menu button on your camera. Let's go through these options. In the first menu, we have image quality. This only refers to pictures, so this camera does not shoot video in RAW. Image review is how long the picture will show once you've taken it. Beep is self-explanatory, and the shutter release without card, keep it on. This basically prevents your camera from taking photos and shooting video without the card being inserted, the memory card, that is. Moving on to option 2, exposure compensation, to make your picture a little bit brighter or a little bit darker if need be. Your ISO settings you can set here. Your auto lighting optimizer, which I have switched off. Your white balance again. Option 3 is your picture style, which we've already gone through. There's my user defined picture style. If you haven't got this, or you haven't got the opportunity to download this, instead of going auto, I recommend going with the neutral option. The second option here, I recommend leaving it in the middle. I personally haven't seen any difference to whichever setting I choose here. Under option 4 is where you find most of the interesting features when it comes to video. This is your movie servo autofocus, which means the lens will be autofocusing constantly to make sure that you're in focus. The autofocus method, which I've spoken about. The movie quality, I film in MP4 in full definition at 25 frames per second. Digital zoom is disabled. Let's get the crispest quality we can get. And sound recording, I leave on manual. I'm using a Rode external microphone, and I like to see and have my volume there controlled rather than the camera deciding on how much noise and volume and sound to take in. On the style menu over here, which is your own menu selection, I have created 3 options, 3 tabs there, and I've put the most useful settings, in my opinion, for quick access, rather than going through all these menus and all them separate tabs from these menus. I have chosen exposure compensation, picture style, recording quality, time lapse, card formatting, Wi-Fi settings, image quality, white balance, autofocus, movie servo, autofocus, LCD brightness, and then customize options for my menu settings to either add, delete any options from my own menu.